This just in from Canada. Chinese from coast to coast are celebrating their right to finally be called Canadian citizens. And the community also is rejoicing that the hated Chinese Exclusion Act is now dead. Get the boats and planes ready. Chinese families separated for decades can now reunite and make their home in the Dominion of Canada.
In May 1947, the Exclusion Act was repealed, and the Government of Canada was voluble in its expression of more fairness and immigration, and a new page had been turned. However, that wasn't quite the case. I found in my research that 9 months later, actually no immigrants had been approved for arrival, not one wife, not one child.
1947 was the repeal of the 1923 exclusion, but that didn't mean the kind of anti-Chinese exclusion somehow ended as well. It was actually restricted to family. So if you were already in Canada, then you could bring your wife and child or children, but they had to be children. So if you had adult children, if they were too old, then you couldn't bring them. And so family reunification became a wrinkle on exclusion.
The immigration officials, in setting the age of 18 as one of the check marks against which a family could be reunited, meant that they were really focused on the age. And how do you know when a person is 18 or they're not 18? And so what they did is they hit upon this scheme of, we will use X-rays. And so this comes up in about 1951.
My oldest brother's experience coming to Canada was that he was over the age limit at the time my father tried to bring him over. He was probably 22, I'm not too sure, but I think they used my sister's birth date, which was the younger sister to my eldest brother. She would have been 2 or 3 years younger than him. So then when he went for his medical exam, they found out that his sternum, his x-rays showed that he was more mature than 20 or whatever they said he was. So then the immigration department got back to my father and said, your son is too old to come over. He looks too old, he looks way over 21, but we can bring him over if you pay us a certain amount under the table. My father, of course, he would do anything to bring him over because it's his number one son, his first son. So of course he went through with it.
我一出世咧2日咧，我爸爸就要過返嚟加拿大啦。因為嗰時政府改變咧，如果你唔走咧，就要你留喺度，就唔准出去。所以我爸爸為咗個家庭，佢就忍痛都離開咗屋企人，再返嚟加拿大。我係經過2次申請先嚟到移民到嚟加拿大，有個 interview 要問話，要問我啲 question， 問我個 question 如果咩唔 match。我爸爸以前嚟啊，即係啲咩講關於鄉下嘅情形。我第一次問話，細蚊仔11歲就見到帶住一個老西人問話，咁細個見到都驚啦。咁你唔好講係西人啦，大人你都驚啦，問你啲話你都驚啦。查得好緊要，即係要查嘅，問成個鐘頭，要問你好多 question。佢話問你飲邊個水井啊？同埋你屋企又有即係條村有幾多人啊？條村有幾多屋啊？同埋你住邊一條巷啊？邊條 aisle 啊？咁啊，同埋你間屋你個 room 個窗係 face 東南西北邊都個 direction 啊？嗰啲要問啲咁嘅 question 㗎。咁啊，同埋咧就即係好多嘢屋企你有咩有養過咩動物啊？ 咁樣嗰啲 question 咁樣嘅，但係佢話我講嗰啲 answer 唔 match 我爹哋，唔得，話我唔係佢嘅仔，所以 deny 咗唔俾我嚟。我梗係 upset 啦。佢話因為佢話到明話係我講得唔啱啲 question，個 answer 唔啱，就所以到第二次申請嘅時候咧，我就好大壓力啦，已經好大 pressure。我驚呢次又失敗，就本來我係1961年嚟嘅，但係嚟唔到啦。就所以咧就 stuck 咗喺香港，咁喺嗰度讀書啦，後尾喺嗰度成長畢業。但係第二次申請都仲係要問話，就要抽我啲血。嗰時咧就未有 DNA， 咁佢咧就話我嘅血型似 match 邊個，咁我嘅血型咧就 match 我爹哋。咁咧又抽我爹哋嘅血，又抽我媽咪嘅血，但係好彩我唔係 match 我媽咪。如果我 match 我媽咪咧，都唔俾我嚟噶啦。
Just to give an example, my grandfather, he had a paper name. So when he came, his father was already here, his 3 brothers were already here, but he had been adopted. And so he really didn't have official papers in his real identity now as the brother of these 3 people, as the son of someone already here. And so he literally had to acquire a paper son identity so that he could actually come in. You could say, well, why did he need this paper identity? Just because you need actual proof of who you are. And if you don't have proof of who you are, then you need proof of being someone else just so you could get in. But by then, what was the purpose? Like, he'd had this paper name. It wasn't him. It had never been him. It was a paper name. He knew who he was. So when he died in 1978, I remember seeing his real name on his headstone. And that was one of the first times I'd actually seen that, because every other piece of correspondence from the government or for his retirement checks, they were always in this paper name. And so he was willing to live this paper son's life, because really it didn't reshape who his relatives were. It didn't, change his life that way.
又驚地喎，驚我唔驚啊！嗰時是好嚴格嘅，查你米紙可能我撥你翻去，驚啊個個。不過當時咧，即係叫到咩話？公開秘密，多數人都係咁咯，咁咪自己我哋中國人自己知咯。即係會乜都唔好係個公開大咁樣，即係我譬如我曉你啦，你梗係知道我係啦，咁啊公開啲啦。即係播嗰啲拍相嗰啲人就唔敢講，用乜嘢梗係用份正紙個名咯。即係叫做合法，如果唔係唔得，係咁咯。好似6幾年嘅話，63年嘛，6幾年我去嗰度改咯。嗰陣時政府收尾都轉翻啦嘛，即係轉我哋肯白叫到肯白，咁咪就自己肯白講翻用翻我嘅真名咯，有好多人都有啫。咪好咯，肯白咪申請一家人來啊乜嘢，即係有我嘅真名，我咪可以我又正式加入皇氏宗親會咯。如果唔係咧，你又入嗰度又就乜啦嘛？你又姓第二姓嘅又來攞黃，又唔係咁方便啦。
Well, as I was only 4.5 when I came to Canada, I think initially I viewed my father as my grandfather because he's quite old, white hair, very kindly. So for all intents and purposes, I thought it was my grandfather. And whenever he took me out, the few times that he did take me out, everybody would ask, "Is that your grandfather?" So that's my first recollections of my dad. My father's name was Yi Hing Chang. He was born in 1888 in China. He came to Canada at a fairly early age, and like many in our generation, we never really got to know the history of our parents. Because he's a very quiet person. I mean quiet. He was a man of little words. He just suffered, never had a harsh word, but just was there all the time. He never told me anything about his previous life, which is unfortunate. But I guess they tend to try and forget some of that hardship.
Well, I don't remember much about that reunion when we first landed here. My father came from Turner Valley. He came out to Vancouver to meet us. The story I hear is my mother said that I didn't know who my father was, so she said to me, "This is your father. You can call him Baba or whatever." And my brothers, being 20-something and my younger brother being 13, they haven't had a father full-time. So for them, their life in Canada was going to be really bad, because here's this guy who says he's your father and you have to obey him, and here you are, a 20-year-old and a teenager, and you have a mind of your own now. So the family dynamics are really affected when you haven't had a father all these years.
但係到1970年就再申請，咁佢話後尾等咗1個月，佢係再等，咁啊後尾就通知話批准我過嚟啦。咁我嚟到咧，我因為21年，我嗰時已經21歲啦，咁從來未見過爸爸，又未叫過爸爸，咁睇嘅鄉下同埋香港見啲人好羨慕，有爹哋有媽咪，我只係有媽咪，咁啊，所以我同我媽咪嘅感情好好嘅，因為不嬲都同佢一齊成長。咁樣就去到即係爸爸喺我唔好意思你樣咩，咁我咧就我臨出發嗰時嚟加拿大，我媽媽同我講，佢哋一陣間去到機場咧，落機咧，見到佢爸爸咧，你一定要第一個要嗌聲爸爸先係有緣，如果唔係咧就冇噶啦咁。咁我應承佢，我話好咁，但係嚟到咧，真係見到一個8·1公喺我前面，我嗌唔出，好 feel bad， 我真係 so far 冇嗌過，嗌唔出，唔係話我唔 love 佢，即係我口講唔出，嗌唔出，即係咁樣情形，係好 sad， 即係一個係好可悲嘅好多經歷。咁就情形係咁樣啦。
I think about my own mother, for instance, and how she lived her whole life until she was 28 years old in a village in China. Her father was in Canada. And so the first time my mother met her father was when she was 28 years old, getting off a plane in Vancouver Airport in 1965. If you think of the impact that families being split, of children who never meet their father until really late in their life, well, what kind of impact does it have? Well, obviously, if you've never even met someone, how could you have a social relationship with them, a familial relationship? They've never been in your life. And so that's both often a loss for a child, to never have known a father. That shaped generations of children growing up, wives having to fend for themselves or raise children, and I think that's something that really has shaped family formation in Chinese Canadian communities in the 20th century. All those people in aggregate who weren't able to form trusting, even loving relationships with family members. Like my mother, you can look at her paperwork and say, oh, yeah, she's 28 years old. It's the first time she comes to Canada and she can meet her father. But how can you understand the kind of traumatic effects on someone's life, on how they grew up, on how that even affects their own children?
When I think about the effects of the Chinese Exclusion Act 100 years ago, I see the roots of a very much made in Canada response and a growth of the anti-discrimination movement. Overall, what does the Chinese community want? I mean, they want hope, they want legacy, They want a future for their children. And we are that hope, that legacy. And so in that way, I see us as the carriers of that memory. The more we understand the story behind the story, the details of what actually happened and what people thought at the time and the decisions that were made, it takes us out of the realm of judging and more into sympathy. We have sympathy for our forebears who quite often they didn't have the words, and so the story that they give us is silence. You know, it's up to us to understand our own history. They gave us the gift of Canadian citizenship and education, and we can give them the gift of our education and their story.